It began like any other autumn morning in the mountains. The air was sharp with cold, the kind that wakes you up before the sun has fully risen. A lone hunter prepared his gear boots laced tight, rifle slung over his shoulder, and a pack filled with the essentials he had carried countless times before. He was a man who knew the wilderness, who respected it, and who never once imagined that the forest he loved would one day keep him for itself. That morning, he parked his truck at the edge of the tree line and disappeared into the vastness of the ridge. Hours passed. The day grew long. When night fell and he did not return, his family grew anxious. By the following dawn, search parties spread across the valleys, combing through ravines, calling his name into the silence. But the forest gave nothing back. No footprints, no clothing, no trace at all. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. His disappearance became another mystery whispered about in the small towns that border the wilderness. Rumors grew. Some said it was a tragic accident. Others believed something darker had happened. And then, a decade later, deep inside a cave that few dared to enter, a secret began to emerge. Bones. A rifle rusted with age. A silent answer to a question left hanging in the mountain air for 10 long years. The hunter's name was Daniel Whitaker. To those who knew him, Daniel was not the sort of man who vanished without reason. At 42 years old, he had lived most of his life in the rugged outskirts of Northern California, a region where the jagged spine of the Trinity Alps carved itself into the sky. He was a quiet man, steady and dependable, the kind who preferred the hush of pine forests over the noise of town. Daniel grew up learning the ways of the land from his father, a logger who taught him to respect the dangers of the wilderness. Hunting, for Daniel, was never about trophies. It was about solitude, the rhythm of the seasons, and the connection to something older than himself. He often hunted alone, moving with a patience and discipline that others admired but few could match. The small town of Weaverville, where Daniel lived, was no stranger to the myths that surrounded the mountains. Locals spoke of sudden storms that rolled in without warning, of hikers who wandered off trail and were never seen again. The wilderness was both beautiful and unforgiving. Caves opened like black mouths in the cliffs. Ravines dropped into shadowy depths. Even seasoned outdoorsmen treated the high country with caution. On the morning of the 14th of October, 2007, Daniel set out before dawn. Neighbors later remembered seeing his truck heading north, loaded with gear. He told his sister, Emily Whitaker, that he planned to be back before nightfall. Emily was used to her brother's hunting trips, but something about that morning felt different to her, though she could never explain why. The Trinity Alps themselves seemed alive, vast and unmapped in places, as though keeping secrets within their ridges and valleys. The rivers cut deep scars into the earth, and the forests were so dense that daylight often felt like twilight beneath the branches. Travelers who passed through described it as breathtaking and unsettling all at once. Daniel was prepared. He carried his rifle, a weathered backpack filled with supplies, and a small compass his father had given him years ago. Yet even for a man as experienced as Daniel, the Alps demanded respect. In those mountains, a single misstep could separate you forever from the world you knew. That day, as he disappeared into the trees, no one could have guessed that Daniel's journey would end in silence and that for 10 long years, his name would be spoken only in whispers across campfires and kitchen tables. The man who once walked confidently into the wild was now a question mark, a shadow lost in the very place he trusted most. The 14th of October, 2007, began like so many other autumn mornings in the Trinity Alps. The peaks were shrouded in mist, and the air carried the smell of wet earth and pine needles. Daniel Whitaker rose before the first light touched the horizon. He packed quietly, his motions practiced, almost ritualistic boots, rifle, backpack, compass. On the kitchen table, he left a half-empty mug of coffee, still warm when his sister Emily later stopped by. Emily remembered the last words her brother said to her that morning. "I'll be back before dark. Don't wait up." It was the kind of promise Daniel had made countless times before, and he had always kept it. He was not a reckless man. If anything, he was cautious, even meticulous. That was why his disappearance felt so impossible. By mid-morning, Daniel's truck was seen parked along a dirt road near Canyon Creek Trailhead, a common entry point into the northern reaches of the Alps. A local hiker recalled passing it around 9 a.m., noting nothing unusual. From there, Daniel likely followed the winding path into the higher ridges, where the trail narrowed and the forest thickened into a canopy of fir and cedar. The weather that day was crisp but stable, the kind hunters pray for. No storms, no sudden winds, just the steady silence of the wilderness. Daniel moved deeper, scanning the ridgelines, pausing to study fresh tracks in the mud. A man at peace in his element. Nothing, in those early hours, suggested danger. But by evening, when the sun dipped behind the mountains and the temperature fell, Daniel had not returned. Emily tried calling his cell phone, but it went straight to voicemail. She told herself it was nothing. Maybe he had stayed longer than planned. Maybe he had lost track of time. Yet as the night wore on, unease gnawed at her. Daniel always called if he was delayed. Always. At midnight, Emily drove out to the trailhead. His truck was still there, parked neatly off the road, keys missing, but with his jacket folded in the back seat. That struck her as strange. Daniel never hiked without layers, especially in the cold October air. She waited in the cab of her car, headlights pointing into the void of the trees, half expecting to see her brother's figure emerge. But the forest remained silent, and the darkness pressed against the windows like a living thing. By dawn, Emily alerted the local sheriff's department. Within hours, a search and rescue team was mobilized. Dozens of volunteers joined, spreading across the ridges with dogs, radios, and flashlights. Helicopters circled overhead, scanning the dense canopy for any sign of movement. The searchers found faint traces, a boot print near a creek bed, a spent rifle cartridge lodged in the moss, and a torn strip of fabric caught on a branch, but none of it formed a clear trail. It was as if the wilderness had swallowed Daniel whole. Days passed, the search widened. Friends described Daniel as too skilled to get lost, too disciplined to wander carelessly. That only deepened the mystery. The sheriff speculated it might have been an accident, a fall into one of the many ravines. Others whispered darker theories, wild animals, foul play, or something more elusive. Emily refused to believe any of it. Each morning she returned to the trailhead, waiting beside the old truck that now felt like a gravestone. She spoke to reporters with a calm voice, but her eyes betrayed her fear. "He's out there," she insisted. "He knows these woods better than anyone. He'll come back." But the days stretched into weeks. The official search dwindled. Winter descended on the Alps, coating the ridges with snow, burying whatever evidence might have remained. By December, the case file was thinned down to a handful of photographs, scattered notes, and the bitter phrase stamped across too many pages: no further leads. For the people of Weaverville, Daniel's disappearance became a story told in hushed tones at the diner, another cautionary tale of the mountain's unforgiving grip. For Emily, it was an open wound that refused to heal. Each time she drove past the trailhead, she swore she could still feel her brother's presence, lingering in the silence of the trees. The 14th of October had begun as just another day for Daniel Whitaker, a hunter who knew the wilderness better than most. But by nightfall, it had transformed into the beginning of a mystery that would haunt his family, his town, and the Trinity Alps for the next 10 years. The morning after Daniel failed to return, the trailhead at Canyon Creek was no longer silent. Trucks lined the dirt road, and men and women in orange vests moved methodically through the trees. Radios crackled, dogs barked, and the air carried the restless energy of urgency. At the center of it all was Emily Whitaker, standing near her brother's pickup truck with arms crossed tight, as though bracing against an invisible storm. The sheriff's department coordinated the first wave. Searchers fanned out along the marked trails, calling Daniel's name, pausing to listen for the faintest reply. Helicopters swept over the canopy, their blades chopping the air in heavy rhythms. From above, the Trinity Alps looked like an endless carpet of green and shadow, beautiful but mercilessly dense. To searchers on the ground, every tree seemed capable of swallowing a man whole. On the first day, hope ran high. They found a single boot print near the creek bed that matched Daniel's size. A neighbor recognized it immediately. That's his tread pattern. Same boots he always wears. Spirits lifted, but only briefly. The print led nowhere, vanishing into the mud as if erased by the forest itself. On the second day, the dogs caught a scent, pulling handlers up a steep ridge. Searchers followed eagerly, clambering over rocks, brushing through undergrowth. The trail ended at a narrow clearing, where a torn strip of camouflage fabric clung to a low branch. The dogs circled, whined, and then sat down, confused. The fabric was collected, bagged, and noted, but there was no Daniel. By the third day, fatigue began to seep into the faces of the volunteers. The forest offered no clues, only silence. Helicopter crews reported nothing but shadows of trees. Radios carried the same weary phrase, negative search, no sign. Emily refused to leave. She remained at the trailhead from dawn until dusk, pacing, praying, whispering her brother's name into the tree line as if he could hear. Local friends brought her coffee, food she barely touched. Reporters appeared, cameras flashing, asking questions she could not answer. "Do you believe he's alive?" one asked. Her reply was steady. "Yes, he knows these woods. He's waiting for us to find him." As the days stretched into a week, rumors began to spread through Weaverville. Some said Daniel had fallen into a ravine too deep to be seen. Others whispered about mountain lions, though no blood or remains were ever found. A few, leaning into old folklore, muttered that the Alps were cursed, that men disappeared here not by accident, but because the mountains wanted them. The sheriff expanded the search perimeter, sending teams miles from the original site. Still nothing. Not a backpack, not a rifle, not a single piece of gear. It was as if Daniel had stepped into another world. By the 10th day, the official search began to wind down. Resources were stretched, winter was approaching, and the probability of survival was dropping fast. Volunteers drifted away, exhausted. Helicopters were grounded. Only a few locals remained, combing the woods with grim determination. For Emily, the ending of the search felt like betrayal. Standing beside her brother's abandoned truck, she pleaded with deputies, "He's out there. We just haven't looked in the right place." But the men shook their heads, their eyes heavy with pity. The forest kept its silence. Whatever truth it held about Daniel Whitaker, it refused to give it back. And so, the official search for Daniel ended, leaving behind only questions, fragments of clues, and a growing shadow over the Trinity Alps. When the search ended, silence replaced the noise of helicopters and radios. The forest returned to its natural state, indifferent to human grief. For Emily Whitaker, that silence was unbearable. Each morning she still drove out to Canyon Creek, standing beside her brother's abandoned truck as though waiting for him to emerge from the trees. Sometimes she left notes tucked under the wiper, messages no one would ever read. "Come home, Daniel. We're waiting." In Weaverville, Daniel's disappearance became a shadow over the town. At the diner, conversations lowered whenever his name was mentioned. At church, prayers were whispered for his safe return, though with each passing week, those prayers grew softer, tinged with resignation. Posters with his face, once crisp and hopeful, faded in the sun and rain until they curled and tore along the telephone poles. Emily carried on as though refusing to surrender. She spoke to local news crews, organized vigils, and pressed authorities to reopen the case. Each time, she was met with the same weary answer. There were no new leads, no evidence, nothing more to be done. For the sheriff, Daniel's file was closed in all but name. For Emily, it was a wound that never healed. The years trickled by, marked by birthdays Daniel never attended, holidays where his chair at the table remained empty. Their father passed away in 2011, still hoping his son would walk through the door. Emily often said that loss felt like losing Daniel twice. She kept his old room untouched, boots lined neatly by the bed, hunting gear stacked in the corner as though preserving it would somehow preserve him. But the silence of the Alps grew heavier with time. Hunters who passed through Canyon Creek spoke of a strange unease in those woods, of feeling watched, of hearing branches snap in the night when no one was there. Some avoided the area altogether, whispering that it was cursed. A decade of unanswered questions weighed on the community. Some believed Daniel had suffered an accident, his body hidden in one of the many ravines. Others whispered darker theories: robbery, murder, or something beyond explanation. But no matter the theory, no proof ever surfaced. The Trinity Alps guarded its secret well. For Emily, every year without Daniel was another reminder that time does not always bring closure. It only deepens the emptiness. And yet, she never stopped hoping. She never stopped believing that one day, somehow, the wilderness would give back what it had taken. 10 years later, on a cold November morning, that silence finally broke. Deep in a cave no one had dared to explore, a discovery was made, one that would change everything. It was November 2019 when the silence finally cracked. 2 hikers from Reading, Mark Collins and his nephew Jason, had wandered deeper into the Trinity Alps than most dared to go. The morning was gray and cold, mist clinging low among the pines. Their plan was simple: follow a forgotten game trail toward a series of caves rumored to shelter black bears during the winter. What they found instead was something far older and far heavier. The entrance was little more than a crack in the hillside, half covered with brush. Jason squeezed through first, his flashlight beam dancing over the rough stone walls. The air smelled of damp earth and something else stale, almost metallic. About 50 feet in, his light caught on a shape. At first, he thought it was driftwood carried in by spring floods. Then he saw the unmistakable curve of a rib cage. The skeleton lay slumped against the wall of the cave, partially buried beneath fallen rocks. A weathered backpack sat nearby, straps chewed by rodents, its fabric bleached by time. When Mark brushed the dirt away from a patch of leather, he froze. Embossed faintly on the surface was a name: Daniel W. They stumbled back into the daylight, shaken and pale. What they had uncovered was not just a set of bones. It was the answer to a question that had haunted Weaverville for 10 long years. Authorities arrived within hours. The sheriff's deputies sealed off the area, forensic teams cataloging each fragment with gloved hands. The remains were carefully carried out of the cave, laid gently in a black bag as though to shield them from the gaze of the forest. The backpack was tagged as evidence, along with a rusted hunting knife and a broken compass found nearby. News spread quickly, racing faster than wildfire. Emily was at work when she got the call. Her hands shook so violently she could barely hold the phone. After a decade of clinging to hope, she was now forced to confront a truth she had dreaded but never escaped. Her brother had been there all along, hidden beneath stone and shadow, less than 5 miles from where his truck was first found. For Weaverville, the discovery brought both closure and unease. Some felt relief that the long vigil was finally over. Others whispered that it raised more questions than it answered. How had Daniel ended up in that cave? Had he crawled there, injured and alone, to wait out his final hours? Or had something led him there, leaving him to vanish from the world above? The Alps had finally given back their secret. But the truth of Daniel Whitaker's final moments remained buried in silence, carved into the stone walls of that cave. In the weeks following the discovery, the Trinity County Sheriff's Department launched one of the most detailed forensic investigations the quiet mountain town had ever witnessed. The bones were sent to Sacramento for analysis, while the artifacts, the torn backpack, the rusted knife, the shattered compass, were cataloged and examined. Dental records confirmed what the town already feared. The remains were, indeed, Daniel Whitaker. But confirmation only deepened the questions. The autopsy revealed no obvious signs of trauma, no bullet wounds, no fractured skull. The bones bore a few scratches, but investigators determined those likely came from years of shifting rock and gnawing rodents, not violence. If foul play was involved, time had erased the traces. That left room for speculation. Speculation that spread like wildfire through Weaverville. Some believed Daniel had simply gotten lost. The broken compass seemed to support that theory. Perhaps he wandered aimlessly, growing weaker as days passed, until he stumbled into the cave seeking shelter. Alone, injured, maybe feverish, he had waited for help that never came. Others weren't convinced. The location of the cave gnawed at them. It lay off the main trails, hidden in dense brush, far from the routes Daniel was known to favor. How could an experienced hunter, familiar with every ridge and valley of the Alps, have strayed so far into obscurity? Then there was the knife. Its blade was dulled, its handle chipped. Some wondered if Daniel had used it to defend himself against an animal or against something else entirely. Rumors whispered of meth cooks and hermits who lurked in the woods during that era, people who wouldn't welcome a hunter wandering too close to their makeshift camps. A darker theory suggested human hands had placed Daniel in that cave. If someone wanted his body hidden, that shadowed crack in the hillside was the perfect grave. Over the years, conspiracy took root. Late-night arguments at the local tavern, anonymous posts on message boards, voices lowered when the sheriff's name came up. Some asked why the search teams had missed the cave in the first place. Was it incompetence or something more deliberate? Emily, though, carried a different theory. She believed her brother had been carrying a secret, one tied to the strange journal entries she had found in his cabin, weeks before his disappearance, scribbled notes about the oak, the voices at night, and a phrase repeated several times, "The forest remembers." She shared these with investigators, but they dismissed them as the ramblings of a man under stress. Yet for Emily, they meant something. She couldn't shake the feeling that Daniel's death was not just an accident, nor a crime, but part of a story the forest itself had swallowed. In the end, the official report listed the cause of death as undetermined, but in Weaverville, theories became legend, and legend became warning. Parents told their children not to wander too far into the trees. Hikers marked the old oak in hushed tones, as though the earth itself was keeping watch. The Alps had given back Daniel Whitaker's body, but the truth of his disappearance remained buried, just out of reach. Years have passed since the sheriff's office closed Daniel Whitaker's file, stamping it with the quiet finality of undetermined. Yet in Weaverville, his story refuses to fade. Hikers still pause at the clearing near the ancient oak, where the wind seems to gather in low, mournful tones. They say at dusk, when the sun slides behind the ridgeline, shadows stretch too long, and the forest grows colder than it should. Some claim to hear the faint echo of footsteps, or the click of antlers brushing against the trees. Others whisper of a voice low, broken, calling out a single name, Emily. For Emily Whitaker, the years have been an endless cycle of grief and unanswered questions. She visits the old oak every autumn, laying a hunting knife across its roots, as though offering something back to the woods that swallowed her brother. Each time she leaves, she swears the forest feels heavier, as if it remembers. What truly happened to Daniel will likely never be known. Was he the victim of an accident, violence, or something older and nameless, written into the soil of those mountains? Theories circle endlessly, but the silence of the cave, the oak, and the bones speaks louder than words. The forest gave up a body, but not the truth. And perhaps that is its cruelest secret. Even now, locals warn newcomers, respect the trees, never linger by the oak after dark, and remember that in Trinity's wilderness, not everything lost is meant to be found. If this story left you with chills, and you'd like to uncover more mysteries buried in forgotten woods and hidden trails, don't forget to leave a like. It helps more people discover these untold tales. And if you want to walk with us through the shadows of history, the wilderness, and the secrets time tried to erase, make sure you subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell. That way, you'll never miss the next story waiting in the dark. Because sometimes, the past doesn't stay buried forever, and neither do the stories.